Okay, this is the second half of the Monday lecture on political economy and institutions. I hope that you can hear this and that everything works. Screen sharing right now. I mentioned after we discussed the rise of capitalism that institutional analyses are crucial for making sense of other kind of really important issues. And sometimes there's this dialectic between the theory and the reality. And that is sometimes the reality, like the Cold War, gave birth to a lot of studies of how countries develop or how they don't. And one of the issues that became important, especially in the 70s and 80s, although there were hints of this earlier, is the idea of dependent capitalism or dependency. And that is that some countries, some economies can be stuck. They can develop, but they do not develop at the same rates as the core countries like North America, Western Europe, or their development is dependent upon those core companies for markets, investment, etc. And so it can be difficult to achieve sustainable growth. This has structural and institutional foundations, that there's something about particular relations of investment, finance, exchange and trade, etc., and that there are institutions that are key players in whether or not a country's economy is dependent and slow or is able to achieve sustainable development on its own. Now, the story tends to be about Latin America as caught up in dependent development, dependent capitalism, versus East Asia, which manages to break out of dependency relations. And the stories of dependent development are really important for BRICS countries. This has been a big topic, especially in Eastern Europe and in Asia, that the BRICS countries are these up-and-coming powerhouses that inevitably are going to become superpowers economically in their own right. So far, the only one that has done that is China. There's hope for India. And even then, there are structural issues at home and with the globe that could put some brakes on whether or not these two countries eventually join the core. The rest are problematic. So all of the talk about the hope for BRICS, we need to be very careful because growth can be temporary and it does not necessarily mean a significant change in one's structural or economic position in the global market, so that growth will be dependent upon the rest of the world. Things like innovation, know-how, and capital. The BRICS are still behind the traditional great powers of North America and Europe. So when we hear talk of BRICS or about import substitution, we're running into issues that harken back to more than 50 years of history and of institutions and structures that sometimes can be forgotten. But there are lessons here to be learned, not only for the present, but also for the nature of how institutions and structures matter. Now, the work on dependent development and development in general, and especially the institutional and structural dimensions of development, gained a lot of knowledge and insight from the comparative histories of Latin America and East Asia. And if you had looked at Mexico versus Japan in 1950, and someone asked you to bet on which of the two countries would be an economic powerhouse in 30, 40 years, you would have looked at the data and you would have said Mexico. 30 years later, it was actually Japan that was on the move, with Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong not far behind, and then eventually China, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so on. So what happened? How is it that Latin America went from a hopeful case to a problematic set of cases? Argentina, Brazil, Mexico in particular are the three cases that are used. How did they go from being so hopeful to hopeless? And vice versa, how did what seemed to be hopeless cases, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, racked by war, without many natural resources, how did they become powerhouses? We have to look for we have to use this method of contrast that I talked about earlier. So let's look for variables as we look at both sets of cases. And we do so by looking at the histories of both the institutional and structural histories. I'm going to start with Latin America. Let's look at the Latin American case. Latin American economies before the Great Depression, before the 1930s, were enclave economies. Basically, they had um, limited economic prospects that weren't awful, that weren't poor, but that did limit growth potentials for these countries. Basically, Latin America was stuck in exporting raw materials, and it could not use income from export of raw materials to develop further. Latin America was in a position called primary product export. Okay. And various Latin American countries had their key raw materials exports for the rest of the world. Let me jump ahead for a second just to give you an idea of what the exports were. Mexico, for many centuries after independence, exported gold and silver, and then other various raw materials, which would eventually, there was some oil. The deposits weren't as great as Mexicans thought, especially in the 1970s, but Mexico exported various raw materials. From Central America, coffee, bananas, other food products. So Central America kind of became the producer for grocery stores in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. Argentina, before the Great Depression, exported meat and hides. Lots and lots of cattle in Argentina, and this was an important part of their export potential. Brazil, coffee, rubber, cotton, other agrarian or agrarian-related exports that the West either could not do or had given up on. Chile exported a lot of copper. Copper was important for industry and technology in the developed countries of Western Europe and the United States. Chile also exported guano, bird crap. I know this might sound kind of funny, but Chile made a lot of money exporting guano. If you look at your geography, Chile is the Andes Mountains, and for 10,000 years, birds have been nesting and living and leaving lots of guano. And over time, there are these old guano deposits. Why is this so important? Guano has nitrates. Nitrates are important for fertilizer and explosives. And in fact, during World War I, the British Navy blockaded Chile because the Germans were importing Chilean guano so that they could make munitions to fight. The British figured that if Chile couldn't export guano to Germany, then the Germans wouldn't be able to produce munitions by the end of 1915 and the war would end. Turns out the Germans found different ways of making the nitrates that they needed, so they adapted. But you can have very interesting exports. Now, this all sounds fine and good. You're exporting a lot of raw goods that then get used in the United States and Western Europe for production. So copper for anything electronic, guano for explosives and nitrate and fertilizer, cotton for clothing, meats and hides for clothing for eating, etc. Why? What's the problem with this? Well, the domestic bourgeoisie in these various countries made money out of exporting these goods. But the problem then became is that the domestic bourgeoisie making money from exports in Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, etc., would then spend that money on luxury goods or in traveling abroad or on imported industrial goods. And in industrial goods, the finished product always has higher value. So the problem is Latin America is making money shipping this stuff to the US or Britain or France, but then they have to go and pay a lot of it back if they want to get finished goods like refrigerators, industrial equipment, etc. And Western economies developed earlier, so they're always ahead in terms of innovation, technological innovation, production practices, goods, marketing, that kind of thing. So Latin America, even though it starts to develop its own industry, it doesn't have the same know-how, technology, skills, or capital. It's always behind because the money that's going, the money that they're gaining is going back into Europe. Furthermore, to the extent the domestic bourgeoisie in Latin America keeps any profit, they tend to spend it on themselves. They're either unwilling or unable to invest enough capital to build railroads, to build factories that can compete with those in the West. So you make money with exports and turn around and pay the West for finished goods. This is the dependency relationship of Latin America on the core, the central economic powers, which are, again, Western Europe and the United States. This isn't necessarily in and of itself a bad thing. However, dependency makes it difficult to sustain your economy, and often it makes it difficult to act independently because developed countries can impose policies on you just using economic leverage. If you don't have enough capital and have to depend on Western banks, the Western banks will tell you what to do. Okay. Now, this does have other negative impacts, as it turns out, on Latin America. Okay. While the local bourgeoisie, especially in agriculture, the agrarian bourgeoisie, do make money, the rest of the population tends to be poor. Peasants in Latin America work on these estates called haciendas, and they work on these for small wages. So they're agricultural labor, not well paid. This, if you've got poverty, a lot of poverty, it's hard to develop a domestic market. Why should Mexico, how can Mexico have its own industry if it can't sell to its own people because they're too poor? Widespread poverty can also lead to political and economic disruptions and instability. Poverty amongst the Mexican peasantry led to the Mexican Revolution in 1910. Kind of fascinating that around the same time, Mexico and Russia both break out in peasant-led revolutions. There's something to that comparison that needs to be done one day. Okay. Furthermore, the money that's coming in from exports went to the bourgeoisie, the elite, but not to the rest of the country. So you get unbalanced economic growth. Okay. You have an underdeveloped middle class, an underdeveloped working class, and a poor peasantry. And that's the bulk of these countries. Here is the basic class structure in addition to the peasantry. Agribusiness. This is the minority agricultural elite. Agriculture is labor intensive. The agricultural elite are resistant to change. They're resistant to using new technology to increase productivity. They don't need to. They're making enough for themselves. Industrialists are underdeveloped. They can't compete with the West. The markets in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina are underdeveloped. So they prefer the use of tariffs, some kind of protection. Not too much protection, because that would then anger Western governments who could lean on them and would, but enough protection to shield these guys from going out of business. State elites and military elites, political elites, were concerned about state power and military power and augmenting it. Although Latin America did not have a lot of war. And as we saw in the first half of this lecture, war is important for the development of the state. So without that much war in Latin America, states and militaries remain underdeveloped. Those elites are thinking about their power and state strength. Finally, you got the working class, which wants a redistribution of wealth, unions, and social protection, like workers everywhere, but they are underdeveloped as well. So you have dependent development, Latin America always behind the West, income inequalities that can be problematic, as we saw in Mexico. This is all sustainable to an extent, if you don't mind being a second-class economy. However, the really big problem, and this is a problem for resource-based countries in general, is that they are sensitive to the broader global economy. When the United States, France, and Britain have recessions, they will be hurt. There will be unemployment. But usually, the core countries, the economic elite countries, first of all, have enough capital, enough know-how that they can adapt to recessions to try to get out of them. They have enough resources and know-how to do so. And when economies are developed, there tends to be some kind of diversification, so that one part of the American economy is hit hard in the Great Depression. Other parts are not hit so hard, so there's some kind of balance there. These resource countries, exporters on the other hand, when the United States, France, Germany, Britain are in recession and can't import as much from Latin America, entire Latin American economies, because they're so dependent on those few exports, get hit hard. The United States goes into recession, Latin America goes into depression. Okay. This was certainly true for Latin America in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries, and this was particularly the case in the Great Depression. As badly as the United States and Britain were hurt, Latin America was hurt much worse. Okay. Okay. So this is the biggie. And your Latin American political and economic elites realize when the Great Depression hits how exposed they are to the global market and how dependent they are on Western markets. Okay. This leads to a reaction. Your Latin American political elites realize they somehow have to shield themselves, or at least ensure themselves against these global downturns. And so there is talk about somehow uh, engaging in economic reforms that can increase some kind of local autonomy. Now, there are a few things going on at the time. First, the Great Depression proves to political elites that Latin American countries, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, etc., have to shield their economies from the rest of the world. They do have examples that legitimate this. The first is the USSR. And there are two facets to the Soviet economy that are important. First, socialism and a strong state in the economy, and autarky. Okay. Strong state in the economy and autarky. Autarky is total independence from the global economy. Okay. And it seems that while the capitalist world is in bad shape, the Soviet economy is humming right along. Not only is there almost no unemployment, the Soviets are building things like Magnitogorsk from scratch. So maybe there's something going on in the USSR and its economic model that is different. You also have John Maynard Keynes, who came to suggest that states should play more active roles in the economy, especially during economic downturns. This is what's called heterodoxy. Okay, a greater role for the state, autarky, etc., runs against classical economics and runs against mainstream economics today. So we get to depression, leads to an economic shock, leads to experiments with existing templates, Soviet economy, Keynesianism. Now, the responses kind of follow different trajectories. In Mexico, the ruling party, or known as the PRI, which is Spanish for the Institutional Revolutionary Party, it makes a turn towards the left and becomes more populist and tries to incorporate trade unions and other populist movements into the government and its projects. In Brazil, you've got the rising power of the military, and this means a right-wing turn. What's interesting, though, is while Mexico becomes more left-wing and the Brazilian regime becomes more right-wing, they will both attempt the same thing. Ideology here is less important than policy models, Keynes, the USSR, and these dependency shocks requiring some kind of response. Simply doing good old-fashioned, let's try to survive until the US market picks up so that we can export again, that's no good. That has failed too often. Okay. So the heterodox experiment done in Latin America, and you guys have heard this phrase before, is import substitution. Okay. Russia's import substitution over the last 9 years is not unique, not new. It's an old story. It was done here in Latin America first in response to the Great Depression. Now, the idea of import substitution, you guys know by now, is instead of importing goods, you produce them yourselves, whether it's some kind of finished agricultural or industrial product. You don't want to import cars, make cars yourself. You don't want to import butter, make butter yourself, or cheese, or whatever. Okay. Why is it that import substitution becomes possible? Why try it now? First, Latin American states are slowly but surely growing stronger, and military and state elites are more interested in increasing that power. So there are interests and some initial capacity amongst state elites to do something, to make these experiments. Okay. So it is possible for them to at least start the experiment. Latin American states are not as big as the Soviet state. They don't reach into every corner of life like the Soviet state did. So they don't have the same capacity, but they have enough to at least start trying to interfere in the economy, to shape the economy. While exporters are hurt in the Great Depression, industrialists are hurt as well, and they start clamoring for some kind of protection by the state. So state elites want to get involved in the economy, and industrialists want them to get involved in the economy. So you've got this alliance between the industrial bourgeoisie and the state. Agricultural and mineral exporters became poorer and weaker in the Great Depression, and so they could not stand in the way of this stronger state projects. Now, the usual case is agricultural and exporting elites tend to like markets because they're always exporting. If you increase tariffs and protection, then other countries will retaliate by not buying your goods. So these guys tend to favor open markets. These guys tend to favor more economic control over the market. But the Great Depression hurts these guys the most. So they can't stand in the way of any new experiments in the way they might have before. So the idea of import substitution, or ISI, import substituting industrialization, takes form. And it takes form in many Latin American countries, again, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico being some of the most important. And the idea is to protect and grow the domestic industry and the home economy. The hope is that this will take time, this will take investment, this will take debt. So we're going to see a lot of debt. But the hope is if you invest today, by tomorrow, in the 10 years in the future, maybe, domestic industries will be able to sell at home and start making money that way. They won't be competing with imports. So there is at least a revenue stream, a captured market, captured consumers. And over time, more time, they'll have made enough profit that they can invest in technology and know-how and start competing with the developed countries. Okay. So use this to start growing your home market, become less dependent on importing finished goods from Western Europe and the United States. This could also potentially contribute to peace and coalitions. So if the state can promote economic growth, industrialization at home, then the industrialists will remain state allies. But if you can also develop your home market, then other elites in the working classes, especially in unions, will be loyal to the state because they too will gain. If the Mexican state can help Mexican industry grow, industrialists and Mexican workers will be thankful and loyal, and you'll have some peace. So let's do ISI. Get your own industry going, less capital flight, because you will pay less for imports. You can do this to make your own money, to make your own profit. You can sell to your own market, which will develop your entire economy. And as domestic industries accumulate profit, they'll be able to reinvest that profit and they will be able to develop. Okay. That is the hope, at least. But how do you do this? To make import substitution work, and these are capitalist economies, this requires capital. Simply squeezing the peasantry and using rations and other dependency to get workers to work, the Soviet model isn't available because these aren't top-heavy socialist systems. These are capitalist. You need money from somewhere. So where do you get money to invest in creating or expanding domestic industry, expanding Brazilian and Mexican textiles, or investing in industrial, chemical, or other production? The most important investor will be the state. The Mexican, Brazilian, Argentinian states had the best access to capital, either through taxation or through borrowing in global markets. Okay. It was more hopeful to lend to the Mexican government than to Mexican businesses because the Mexican government was less likely to go bankrupt or disappear. So the state could borrow or could use taxation to gain enough capital to invest in building industries. It could also take over industries, buy them out if it wanted to. Okay. So only the state can borrow money, and it borrows from Western banks as well as its own people today, and hoping that it'll generate enough profit through state-owned industries to pay those debts back in the future. Okay. Now, the nice thing about the state being the main investor is it can be strategic. The problem with a market like the United States is you have many, many different investors who are going to want a say in whatever is their money is used for. the state can be strategic and target a few sectors and can create state-owned monopolies. If a monopoly is owned by the state can make sure that the monopoly will not engage in price gouging or abusing consumers. Having a few state-owned enterprises means ease in investment and in planning. Now, this is the case in the USSR, and we saw this was the case in France and in Japan. We talked about Jones Eisman. So here's some examples. The Mexican state gets involved in the state-owned monopoly Petróleos Mexicanos. This is oil extraction and refining. Similarly, in Brazil, the state-owned monopoly Petrobras. Again, oil refinery, refining, oil extraction. The Mexican, Brazilian, and Argentinian governments also invest in state-owned enterprises in automobiles, steel, chemical production. So a lot of major industry becomes state-run, state-owned, because the state can then target investment. It's very efficient. This kind of looks a lot like NEP in the 1920s USSR, at commanding heights where the state plays an important role in investing and shaping and developing. Furthermore, when the Mexican or Brazilian or other states don't have enough capital, because states are the most stable and important organizations, they can organize alliances of investors. And what you get in many Latin American states is what's called a triple alliance. Okay, the triple alliance is state investment and ownership, plus the domestic bourgeoisie investing, and sometimes foreign capital. Now, foreigners will not own a significant share of property in all of these firms. The state will own the majority. But foreign capital will get involved in these projects because they will get a revenue stream. If a state like Mexico is starting an oil monopoly, there's a good chance that it will make money and it will not go bankrupt because the state will keep supporting it. So the Latin American states can use their own money, and because the state is fairly solid, it can encourage its own Mexican or Brazilian bourgeoisie and foreigners from the United States or Britain, for example, to invest as well. Now, what this leads to is a corporatist structure, one in which various economic sectors are organized not like the free market, many separate actors, but a lot of actors brought together under one umbrella. Okay, trade unions become incorporated into leading political parties or the state, for example. The private sector of enterprises and corporations, because they are state subsidized or state owned, are also incorporated into the state. It's not as big and complex as the Soviet system. Okay, Latin America is kind of a minor version of the Soviet economy, but still there's a great deal of this incorporation. So the state takes the lead in reorganizing Latin American economies, investing in them, and creating an industrial base, taking on debt in the process, but in the hopes of building domestic industries that can insulate these countries from global economic shocks and that can keep capital back in the country. The dream for Mexico or Brazil would be, when the Great Depression ends, to export once again, get money from Western countries by selling them hides, meat, copper, etc., but keeping that money inside the country because you don't need to buy imports from the United States or Britain. You make them yourselves. That's the hope, at least. Now, there are dangers involved. Okay, and these will become clear over time. Danger number one, populism. Okay, when the state subsidizes or owns industries, the employees will look at the state not only as the government that runs the country, but also as the boss. The economy and politics kind of become fused. Employment in state-owned firms is, in a sense, like a bribe to the population. And the bribe is Mexican workers have jobs, therefore they don't go on strike, they remain calm. Okay, so there's this kind of social contract of sorts between the state and Mexican population. Let the state run the show, the state will invest, Mexicans will have jobs. Sounds really good. It's a way of keeping a population quiescent, peaceful. It's that kind of dependency power that is really important in the Soviet Union, for example. There is, however, a problem with this, and it's one that Soviets, and especially in the 1990s, post-Soviet governments will come to realize. What do you do with firms that are inefficient and need reform or restructuring? Okay. A steel factory, an auto factory, they can start small, then they can grow, they can get profitable, but you have to keep innovating. And sometimes innovations require laying off or firing workers, either because there are too many of them, or you're bringing in new technology, automation, so you don't need so many workers, or you need workers with new skills if you have new technology. So what capitalist firms in the US or Britain do is, if you have to fire workers to save on costs, or if you have to fire workers to restructure, maybe you need to close down part of your production, and so you can open up another kind of production. Got to fire some workers. In the United States, that's the rules of the game. You get fired, you look for another job. Workers can get annoyed, they can get mad, they can go on strike against the company that fired them, but that's it. What if, however, the company is run by the state? That means unemployed workers are not only going to engage in economic disruption like strikes, they will engage in politics. If the state is your employer, you push back by going on strike against the state. Okay. And the thing about Mexico and Brazil and all these other countries that do ISI is both the elites and populist sectors, especially unions, benefit from the state investing in all of these state-owned corporations, these state-owned enterprises. Okay. They don't want restructuring. They want the state to keep investing in them so that they will be stable. Okay. This is a potential problem. If you restructure, that might lead to unemployment. If your economy faces problems and you need to change, it might lead to unemployment. And it does. You get these business cycles. But you risk political instability when the state is this involved in the economy. This is a potential danger. Now, for many decades after World War II, this doesn't seem to be a problem because these economies are growing. But this is something to keep in mind. Okay. Now, where things will start to unravel will be in the 1970s. In the 1970s, OPEC, Middle Eastern countries and OPEC, suddenly raised the price of oil. And this leads to all kinds of problems in the West: stagflation, stagnation, and inflation. The rising price of energy means prices go up everywhere, and this leads to economic challenges and crises in Western Europe and North America. On the other hand, OPEC countries are making a lot of money from selling their oil, and they got to do something with them. So what do? They put that money in Western banks, many in the US. Now, Citibank and others get all of this OPEC money. They can't just sit on that money. They've got to loan that money out. Now, in the 1970s, interest rates are low. So if banks want to make money, they have to lend out a lot of money. Who are they going to lend out that money to? Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. They borrow enormous sums of money from Western banks. They borrow all of that, all those petrodollars. First, the banks need to invest them. They need to lend them out somewhere. Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil want to borrow more money because then they can invest further in state-owned enterprises and invest more and more in maybe new projects like oil and oil refining in Mexico. Okay. And here, Latin American countries have this problem. Okay. Their firms remain inefficient, but you can't have restructuring because that means unemployment. Another facet of import substitution is stable prices. Part of the social contract between states and society are to keep prices from changing too much, similar to the Soviet system, keep prices low over time. All of this leads to economic inefficiencies, and the state needs to inject increasingly large sums of money to keep state-owned enterprises afloat. Fortunately, in the 1970s, all of these banks have a lot of petrodollars. So Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico borrow a lot of money to cover debt and inefficiencies in their state-owned enterprises, which are very large. They're not doing badly, but they're not effective competitors with the rest of the world. In a sense, the state becomes locked into the economy now to protect unions, sectors, and elites. from instability and from competitive pressures from the West. To restructure or to privatize, to sell off state-owned enterprises, would mean the state is backing out of the economy, but again, this risks unemployment and bad politics. Furthermore, Latin American countries are now increasingly locked into debt. Okay, even more debt, especially in the 1970s. The incentives for restructuring and reforming sectors like oil, chemicals, steel, automobiles, the incentives to restructure are low. Incentives are actually to be conservative, just as in the Soviet Union, to maintain employment, to maintain the social contract with the population, and to defend the country against Western competition. Especially in the 1970s, with the rise of oil prices, Western corporations start to become more efficient in their production. Their productivity starts to rise. They're a threat now to Mexican, Brazilian, and Argentinian industry. They could either restructure, the incentives are against that, or just borrow money and keep everything going, which, by the way, East European countries will do too. One of the reasons communism collapses in East Europe is because Poland, Hungary, and other countries borrow a lot of money around the same time from Western banks and then can't pay it off. Now, let's be fair. ISI works for a while. And in fact, you get what are called the miracle economies of Latin America. Let's go to Mexico. 1950 to 1981, economic growth averages 6.1% per year. Industry makes up 22% of total output in 1950, 29% in 1970. Okay. Brazil, average economic growth per year is 7% for these years, then 11% for these years, down to 6.9% as things start to stagnate a little bit for these years. These are impressive growth rates. Now, they're being fueled by state subsidies to buy more technology. State subsidies mean Mexicans and Brazilians have more money to spend because there's more employment, and by a lot of foreign debt, growing foreign debt. There's a lot of money going into an economy that isn't producing a return on investment, or at least an economic return. It's producing a political return, and it's producing a lot of growth, but on the back of debt. This will explode, okay? So as I've been saying, state-owned enterprises employ citizens. Restructuring means you can't fire them. How do you restructure, however, if debt becomes too great? If debt becomes too great and countries need to restructure, what do you do? So far, that hasn't been an issue until the late 1970s. Now, you have inflation in the United States and Western Europe because of the rising prices of oil. To combat this, Paul Volcker, who's chairman of the American Central Bank, raises American interest rates to reduce American inflation. This will lead to a recession in the late 70s and early 80s. But it will bring the inflation rate down from double digits to single digits, stabilize the American economy, and set the path for economic growth in the 1980s. So Volcker raises interest rates. It'll hurt the American economy. It's going to be even worse for Latin America because the interest payments on all of that Latin American debt will suddenly go up. Okay. When Latin American countries borrowed all that money in the 70s, they presumed interest rates would stay low. This does not happen. And by 1982, between original debt, the principal, and the interest, debt becomes a bomb in these three countries especially. 1982, Mexican debt is $80 billion. And in fact, Mexico will default in 1982. That's how bad debt is. Inflation soared to 100%, and debt made up 78% of the Mexican GDP. Argentina, debt of $40 billion. Brazil, $85 billion in state and private debt together. Now, this might not sound like a lot today, okay? This was, 40 years ago? But the global economy has really expanded and grown, so all right, $40 billion, Hollywood makes that much off of Marvel Comics films. This is a huge amount of money back then, okay? So this means these three countries, especially but much of Latin America, are in trouble. And in fact, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil were really on the edge of economic collapse. Now, of course, the United States and Western Europe don't want this, so there are negotiations between private banks, the United States government, and the International Monetary Fund. And The solution is that the IMF and the USA would make loans to these Latin American countries, to these three in particular. They would lend them money so they could meet their debt payments. They wouldn't have to go bankrupt. However, the IMF and the USA demand something in return. These two are not going to pay off Latin American debt in their entirety. They will loan money, not give it. They will loan enough money to meet debt payments to create a breathing space. However, they also want Mexican, Brazilian, and Argentinian economies to restructure and to eventually grow so they can get out of debt and become sustainable. This will mean the end of ISI. That's really the demand of the US and the IMF. First, this requires austerity programs. Reduce taxes. Latin American countries could do ISI by having high taxes, especially high corporate taxes, and using that money for subsidies. But if taxes are high, there's not an incentive for private entrepreneurship. So the demand is, you want to receive these loans and keep your economies from totally crashing, reduce taxes. That will encourage private entrepreneurs to invest in their own private projects. Now, if you're going to reduce taxes, first of all, you're reducing subsidies to state-owned enterprises. That also means welfare and public services are going to be hurt. So basically, Latin American countries are going to go through a few years of pain and poverty. The hope is that after rapid pain and rapid adjustment, the economies will start to grow again. Further, state-owned enterprises, SOEs, are inefficient and relying on state debt, state subsidies to survive. So privatize them, sell them off. This will have two positive results. The first is if the state privatizes, it makes income. Selling off state-owned firms is income that can go to pay off all of its debt. But also that means that these state-owned enterprises become private enterprises. And private owners have more of an incentive and more rights to restructure firms to make them healthy. Furthermore, the IMF and the United States require economic liberalization. This means basically making it easier for private entrepreneurs to open their own firms, so less red tape, less bureaucratic obstacles. It also means freeing up prices. Recall, I said before that one part of this social contract was keeping prices low and stable. Well, make prices free so that supply and demand curves meet and you have greater efficiency in the economy. Furthermore, to keep with austerity, hard budgets. Okay, hard budgets being that enterprises and the state have to live off of whatever income they make. This is an incentive to be effective and efficient with investment as well. Basically, this was the plan that some economists trained at Chicago, known as the Chicago Boys, implemented in Chile in the 1970s after Augusto Pinochet overthrew the socialist government. So in the 1970s, we get this plan in Chile. In the 1980s, Jeffrey Sachs, who was a Harvard economist, comes up with this idea for Latin America. It is called shock therapy. This will then be used in the 1990s for a bunch of countries whose economies were similar to ISI, if not bigger and more radical. The communist countries of the former Soviet Union and East Europe. Basically, the story we see here of dependent development, of import substitution, of debt, and of the way out will be reflected in the 1990s. This is your history, done in Latin America first. See, nothing's ever unique in economic history. Things keep repeating themselves. Okay. Now, the hope was there'll be a few years of pain, but eventually things will recover. First of all, they'll get foreign ownership and foreign investment. This means more money will come into the economy because foreigners will have property rights. Previously, under ISI, foreigners could invest some and receive returns on their investment, but they were always minority shareholders. The state would be the majority shareholder. Foreigners would come along for the ride. Now foreigners will be the owners. They can bring in lots of cash, but they'll have the right to call the shots, to restructure enterprises as they see fit. This does mean there's economic growth. It also means the threat of capital flight. If the Mexican government doesn't enact policies that foreign investors like, they'll sell and leave and go buy in Mexico or Brazil or somewhere else. Capital flight is a funny thing. Capital flight can mean speculation runs rampant. That's bad. It could also potentially keep governments from being too radical. It can become a form of accountability. So capital flight has its pluses and its minuses. The minuses tend to get ignored in shock therapy, and the pluses are accentuated. One thing this will do is note we are a return to dependency. At least when there was ISI, Latin American economies were becoming independent of the global market, except financially. And that financial dependence will lead to crisis in the 1980s and shock therapy, which requires emasculating Latin American states and essentially opening markets to foreign competition, to foreign ownership, making Latin American countries dependent once again. ISI failed. Latin America returned to where it had started from, which is why I made this warning about BRICS countries. Beware. Maybe China and India are doing something right. I suspect there is something going on there. The rest, you got to see. That's the Latin American story. Okay. We're not done yet. We have to talk about East Asia, which is the success case. Okay. The success case. Okay. We have Japanese growth rates, which I thought I had on a slide, but somehow I missed, so my apologies. So Japanese growth rates start slow, but really pick up. In the 1970s, Japanese steel and autos start seriously competing in the American market. And the fear is that Japan is going to overtake the United States before long. It didn't happen for various reasons, but Japan's growth was astounding. By the 70s and early 80s, it became clear Japan was a sustainable economic powerhouse, and they weren't alone. In the 1980s, the talk is not only of Japan, but the East Asian dragons, or sometimes tigers. One or the other have been used. South Korea and Taiwan also start making inroads into Western markets. Electronics for the two, and these days, cars from South Korea, as well as ships and other things. Hong Kong and Singapore follow, and then eventually China. Okay, but Vietnam and other countries. What is going on in East Asia that is different from what was going on in Latin America? Why is there this different trajectory? It has to do with policies and institutions like the state and economic structure. Okay, why were they lucky? Consider the following. There are some similarities, but there are some differences. East Asia and Latin America, after World War II, were both on the periphery of the developed world. North America and West Europe are in the core. You have the Soviet Union, the socialist camp, and all the rest of the countries are trying to catch up. Both East Asia and Latin America are second status economies. East Asia was devastated by European and Japanese imperialism, colonialism, and then by World War II. So you look at East Asia in 1945 and think, wow, these countries are decimated. They'll never make it out. Latin America hadn't been affected by World War II. Okay, relative peace, better integration into global markets, and with ISI, they're setting the stage for their own independence. Latin America looked on top of things. East Asia, bad case, didn't happen. That was because East Asian countries followed export-oriented industrialization, a different approach to that which was done in Latin America. Okay? And in a sense, this is a different take, possible because of the state. Okay, one of the keys to East Asian successes was rather than insulate themselves from global markets like the Soviet Union, rather than focus on developing their home markets primarily, they decided to use the developed markets, the United States and Western Europe, to exploit them for profit. In a sense, export-oriented industrialization accepts the dependency position that Japan and Korea and other countries were in. Accept that dependency position, but use it to your advantage, and maybe eventually you will get out of dependency and make other countries dependent upon you. And have a different take on this. Now, let's get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of this history. From 1945 to around the 1960s, and the end date depends upon the country, East Asian countries also used ISI. And this kind of made sense. Okay. First of all, you had the Latin American example to build upon and the Soviet example, and you had Keynesianism. So focusing on sheltering and developing your home market, keeping the global market at arm's length, it all seemed to make sense. Okay. Especially after World War II, Asian economies were in bad shape. Again, war, civil war, Japanese colonialism and occupation, etc. ISI, where the state directs investment in building economic infrastructure and industrial industry, where the state invests in economic and industrial infrastructure. That made sense. Okay. The state in all of these countries really is the last major group standing. In South Korea, for example, the agricultural elite were destroyed by Japanese colonialism, which actually ended up being a blessing. They could not stand in the way of economic reform. Industrialists had been hurt by the war. So who's left? The state. It's the only really significant economic actor. So the state is going to take the lead in rebuilding these economies. So ISI makes sense. Western economies are also restructuring after the war. The global economy is also rebuilding. Who do you sell to? You're not going to sell to Great Britain. They're also recovering from the war. France was occupied. Um, Germany was decimated in the last year of the war, and the Soviet Union took incredible hits, and it's isolated from the capitalist market anyhow. Who are you going to sell to immediately after World War II? Okay, by the 1950s, you can sell to America. The American economy, it's still strong. It's really the only one standing. But it kind of made sense to focus on developing your home market. Furthermore, post-war Asian polities are not particularly democratic. The Americans might have imposed elections, but you basically would have a dominant party in Japan, for example. And in Taiwan, it was authoritarian after Chiang Kai-shek had to flee from China and establish the Kuomintang on the island of Taiwan. So ISI not only is a way to build these economies, it's also a political bribe. In authoritarian or soft democracy, soft authoritarian regimes, which aren't openly democratic, the best way to keep the population under control is either to repress or to bribe. And bribery was going to work better after Japanese authoritarianism. So for at least 15 years, ISI makes sense. Asia is following the Latin American model. Okay. However, in the 1960s, East Asian leaders start turning away from ISI and they turn to focusing on exports. Why is that? First, their domestic markets were still underdeveloped, less developed than in Latin America. So developing your home market is going to be a long, slow process. Expecting that you will make money selling to your home market is even worse of a prospect in Japan or Taiwan than in Mexico or Brazil. And ISI requires borrowing a lot of money to build industry and hope that growing employment will create a local market. Latin America could try and do that. East Asia could not. First, it was more hurt from the war, and here, Cold War again. East Asia is on the front line with communism. Okay, the only communist country in Latin America in the 1960s is Cuba. It's one country, and if they make trouble, well, you got a neighbor up to the north with a pretty big army. Different story here. Japan, we had the Korean War, which ends in 1953, so we've already had conflict. Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, they are on the front lines with communist China and the USSR. So we don't have 30 years to think about slow ISI development. It has to be faster. And the USA is providing some aid to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Not loans, but subsidies of sorts. This is kind of a gift to help these economies develop so that they would be on our side in the Cold War, the capitalist world. However, there were warnings from the State Department that that American aid was going to be temporary. These countries needed to be more self-sufficient. Okay, this source of capital would dry up in East Asia is going to need some kind of money, but it might not get the same foreign investment loans from banks, for example, that Latin America gets. So there's a turn to focusing on exports. Asian countries can do this in a way that Latin American countries can't. Just to reiterate, Latin America, when you get ISI, the state and elite become too close. Mexican and Brazilian elites rely on the state for subsidies in all of these firms and in the economy to keep the economy humming. On the other hand, the Mexican and Brazilian states are dependent upon the elites to run a lot of that state-owned industry or to provide additional investment. And what you get is corruption or the elite supporting the state so long as there is no innovation or radical restructuring. In other words, the state and elite are both engaged in rent sinking in Latin America, and the state gets caught in this. Furthermore, just to remind you, because the state is a big employer, you have populism, and so the Latin American states are caught. They're dependent in a way. East Asia, because ISI really hasn't taken root, East Asian states have greater freedom to act. Okay, they're not trapped. They're also kind of the biggest organization still standing. They are constrained in what they can do, however. They can defend their domestic markets to a certain extent from global competition, just like Mexico and Brazil do. But because Japan and Korea don't create state-owned firms, it's one thing they don't do. They can actually force domestic firms to compete. Okay, so there can be some collusion, some deals between private businesses that will allow the creation of empires. More on this in a moment. But in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, the state stays out of the economy. Okay, it doesn't really take ISI that far as Mexico and Brazil and Argentina did. So it can actually compel restructuring and efficient production. In fact, in South Korea, this is really taken far because under ISI, the Korean government was pretty corrupt. It gave a lot of money to private businesses as subsidies in return for elite support. And when there was a coup d'etat and the Korean military took over, it started hunting down all of those corrupt deals and forced Korean businesses that had been receiving corrupt money from the state to take that money and make profit, to make something of it. The South Korean government actually starts enforcing competition and innovation among South Korean firms. Now, there is something about Asian states that make them more efficient at designing policies. There's something about state structures and state institutions in East Asia that makes them different from those in Latin America and even in the United States and some of West Europe. Okay, first, because the state is the most prestigious and powerful organization, the best people will often come to work in the state. This is similar to France, and in fact, Japan kind of modeled its civil service reforms after those of France. Okay, now the state is the chief source of finance, not only subsidies but loans and other kind of investment. So the state is an important player in the Japanese economy. The best graduates from Todai and other universities, as in France, will go to work for the state. So there's a lot of human capital in the Japanese state traditionally, as in France. MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, is a really important ministry that gets a lot of these graduates. This is the organization, this is the ministry that targets investment. What MITI likes to do, is traditionally done, is engage private business in Japan, provide them investment, and engage Japanese businesses on coming up with long-term strategies for using that investment. The Japanese state doesn't dictate, it negotiates. Because Japanese business might depend on them for money, but Japanese business is private, not owned, state-owned, as in Latin America or in the communist bloc. Now, important point here. The Japanese state has money, good people, strong structure. It's negotiating with business. This is facilitated by something called amakudari. Amakudari is the descent from heaven, is what it's called. These really good graduates work in the Japanese government, but then they retire in their 50s. They retire young. Well, if you've really worked your way up in the Japanese bureaucracy, where do you go when you retire? Simple. You go to work for private business as the lobbyists, or better yet, the mediators between the state and business. This creates a set of networks for consultation. Japanese businesses will use these people when they are negotiating with the state for investment. The state, in turn, will go to these people, their former colleagues, when negotiating with businesses. So the state can direct business because of finance, but these networks create communication between state and business. So the Japanese state can say, we have these plans for future investment. Businesses can come along and say, well, there are some problems in your plans. There are strengths, there are weaknesses. And the state and businesses will work together to come up with optimum long-term plans. Now, what helps is Japanese economy. It's similar to France in that you've got a bunch of national champions. They're private, not state-owned. But they are these few big empires that control a lot of the Japanese economy. Used to be called Zaibatsu and later changed to Keiretsu. Okay, Japanese empires, big conglomerates. South Korea is something similar. They're called the Chaebol. Taiwan's the different one here. Here you have smaller firms that are closely networked. This follows the Chinese model. A firm, when it grows, instead of it growing into a bigger empire, it starts to split off. And family members who are networked will run all of these small firms. So you've got a different kind of network structure working in Taiwan. That said, the state does play an important role in Taiwan by encouraging competition, by helping to negotiate and create longer term plans for the business climate in Taiwan. The state dictates less than in Japan or in South Korea than it does in Taiwan, but it still plays an important role. Okay. So how did all this come to pass? How did we get to the situation where you've got a strong state that can invest and negotiate but not dictate? And by the way, that negotiation, where it is supremely important, is it's kind of the wisdom of the crowds. You have bright people working in the state who then go and work for industry, and bright people working in Japanese industry. They negotiate, they compromise, they brainstorm instead of dictating, as in the communist bloc or Latin America. So you get good innovation and good long-term projects, which is one of the reasons why Japan and Korea do a great job of conquering various markets. One example, by the way, in the 1970s, Honda was considered a joke, except for motorcycles. Honda motorcycles were great. Honda's cars in the 70s were a joke. They were cheap, but the Japanese had a strategy. Sell cheap cars that will sell to American consumers who can't afford the more expensive Ford, Chrysler, or General Motors. Germany would do the same thing with the Volkswagen. So Honda makes a lot of money selling to a niche. Toyota does the same thing, by the way. Sell cheap cars that American college students will buy. But once you get that niche, Honda starts making a lot of money off of that. And between profits and state investment, Honda can start developing cars that are more expensive, but also higher quality, because engineers are really good in Japan. By the 1980s, Honda and Toyota are starting to take over the American market. And in fact, they're pretty dominant even today. Following that comes Hyundai in the 1990s and the 2000s. Hyundai is, like Honda was, a joke car. Cheap, not all that dependable, but affordable for many Americans. Makes a lot of profit. Hyundai starts investing in quality, starts selling to the middle and upper middle class. Hyundais aren't that cheap anymore, and they certainly have a better reputation than they used to. So the slow, steady focus on export markets, especially the American market. How is all of this possible, though? The Chaebol and a nice concentrated state with a lot of human capital. Where does this come from? Well, South Korea, the South Korean state is accidentally the most powerful actor in Korea. You have Japanese colonialism, which destroys the landlord class. So between colonialism, World War II, and the Korean War, the landlords who controlled most of the land and exploited it disappear. So land reform becomes possible. When land reform is possible, then you can have agricultural entrepreneurs, farmers. That means better production of food. That means life can become cheaper. This is what China will do under Mao Zedong, and what can only happen with the collapse of communism in the USSR. There is money from the United States that kind of helps get the ball rolling, gets everything started, because Korea is on the front line with communism. The Korean Army, thanks to the Korean War, is a really important organization, makes the state strong. And the Korean state, because the bourgeoisie is underdeveloped and the state got ravaged by Japan, is the main source of money to finance business. The state will drive investment. Now, this led to corruption in the 1950s under the first democratic government. The Chaebol emerged as corrupt empires based on money stolen from the state. They are kind of like the original oligarchs. But with the coup d'etat, the military regime in the 1960s forces the Chaebol to stop stealing from the state and to use that money to become efficient innovators and producers. Sorry, typo there. Okay, so very similar to Japan. And the best graduates in South Korea go to the government, just as in Japan. So a very similar structure as in Japan that allows South Korea to kind of follow the same model. Okay. So Japan and Korea, and then later Singapore, will start to set the way as models for the rest of East Asia in a way that Mexico and Brazil did for Latin America. Either you have authoritarian regimes, as in Singapore and South Korea under the military, or you have democracy, but it's hard to call it real democracy. Really, what you have is soft authoritarianism or real authoritarianism. China, South Korea under military rule, Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek, those are authoritarian regimes. Japan, for the longest time, has one-party rule, the Liberal Democrats, although the real power is inside the state bureaucracy. Now, some people will say, no, democracy, that's bad. We saw Darren Acemoglu suggest that, in fact, democracy is good, and that's a valid point. However, these kind of regimes could impose discipline and sacrifice on their populations so that at least for a few decades, you could get people to work hard to accumulate capital, savings, not demand really high wages, and make exports affordable. This is in contrast to populism in Latin America, which kind of retarded growth. Now, eventually, there is some degree of democratization in Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, and you could argue this helps sustain development in these countries. At some point, as Acemoglu showed, dictatorships, authoritarian regimes can start to hurt economic growth. Okay, so we've got a comparison of the two. I've given you these two histories. My last point, and then we'll end, is let's step back and really bring these two cases together. And this is where sociologist Peter Evans thinks he discovered why the differences between Latin America and East Asia emerge. Why is it that Latin America got stuck, East Asia did not? I gave you separate histories, now let's compare them systematically. Evans suggests that there are two dimensions to the state and its relations to the economy. First, embeddedness, and the other, autonomy. Embeddedness is the degree to which there are state and business linkages. To what extent is the state embedded in the economy? The more a state is embedded in the economy, the greater the relations are with business, and that provides communication so that the state and business can talk with each other and negotiate and figure out the best way to structure policies and investment. Now, embeddedness can have a price. Too little embeddedness, the state won't know what the best policies are for business. Too much embeddedness, the state can become captured. The state will depend upon elites or become corrupted by them. One could argue this has happened in the United States and Great Britain. The other dimension to after embeddedness is autonomy, the capacity of the state to act. One part of autonomy is internal cohesion. To what extent does the state have cadres who are educated and trained, human capital, and who are committed to the state and have a sense of esprit de corps? That is, to what extent are state officials honest, hardworking, smart, and believe in what they're doing? They have a sense of mission. While states should be embedded in their economies, they have links to businessmen, they also need to be insulated so they can't be controlled. It's one thing to talk to business, it's another thing to be controlled by them. Now, too much insulation can hurt embeddedness. There has to be a balance between the two. When you have that balance, you have what Peter Evans calls embedded autonomy, and here's the best Russian translation I can find, Включенная автономия. If a state has too much freedom, it can be a predator. If there's too little freedom, it becomes captured and corrupted by the elite. What Evans does is he creates a nice 2x2 table. To what extent is a state embedded in an economy or not embedded? To what extent does it have autonomy or it's not autonomous? And here we can have 4 cells. Now, one cell is kind of absent. State doesn't have autonomy, it's not embedded. They really don't have great examples that fit this. South Korea, Japan, those are cases of embedded autonomy. Amakutori, the fact that your state officials retire early and go work for businesses, this creates relations. That the Chaebol and the Zaibatsu are these empires, but there are only a few of them. It makes it easier for state and business to negotiate. Okay, so South Korea and Japan have embedded autonomy, the right balance between a state that's autonomous and a state that is linked to society. States that have too much embeddedness, but where the state is not well developed, your state officials might not have the same human capital, they might not have good wages, you get state capture. So the state ends up doing what business wants or needs. Latin America, this happens a lot under ISI. One could argue that this is the case today in the United States and Great Britain. Other cases will be those where the states are autonomous but not embedded. Now, sometimes you get distance. This means states might act in an arrogant fashion towards business. Your state officials will have a lot of red tape and not be helpful towards business people, or they just won't do policies that work well. India was this for many years. It seems to be coming out of this somehow. We need a little more research on this. But the joke used to be that India would send its bright computer IT people to the United States to get PhDs. And then those Indians would stay in the United States and open their own businesses because it's easier to open a business in the US than in India because Indian bureaucrats were hostile to businesses. The Indian state was autonomous enough it could dictate to businesses, but not embedded enough so that state bureaucrats weren't always friendly or useful. Alternatively, if states are autonomous but not embedded, they can be predatory, where the state will just, Zaire was a case in point in the 1980s, 1990s. State bureaucrats will basically target businesses for rent seeking. This is not good for growth either. Okay. Okay. Being in the right quadrant is not easy. How do you end up here? You can hope for the best, and South Korea and Japan certainly have planned well. But I hope you're starting to see from the history that a lot of this was accidental. Okay. Suffering in World War II was not planned, but it was part of the pathway to success for Japan and Korea. Because colonialism in Korea, losing the war in Japan, broke the stranglehold of some elites and left the state in a situation where it could start to shape the economy without entirely controlling and dictating for it. That is, Japanese fascism might have helped clear the way for later growth. Latin America, fewer wars, less suffering, weaker states. ISI, when adopted, seemed to make sense. And Latin America did have access to enough capital, and they weren't on the forefront with communism. They could take their time with ISI, but that led to populism, and that led to states becoming dependent upon foreign money and on state-owned enterprises. So we have these accidents of fate that seem to lead us in one direction or the other. The United States was lucky to be an early industrial regime. They had decades to develop. But maybe there's too much embeddedness, not enough autonomy in the United States. Can the US adjust? Let's see. In the case of Russia, Soviet Union, too much autonomy, too little embeddedness. Was this like India? Russian ISI seemed to be working in some sectors, at least in agriculture. What about electronics, automobiles? The dependency on oil persists. Is ISI creating a trap for Russia that it did for Latin America? Or does the Russian state have the embedded autonomy that is necessary to keep import substitution from leading into a trap? Lots and lots of questions, lots and lots of things to think about. So, embedded autonomy, state structures and institutions can help us understand the nature of growth. And Latin America and East Asia have provided us important test cases to develop insights about how institutions operate, but more importantly, the kinds of institutions and structures that matter the most. So this is a lot of material. I am going to stop things here, give you all the time to digest this, and on Wednesday, sorry about that, on Wednesday, we can discuss this a little further. So thank you much, and I'll see you Wednesday.